They say that every man carries a shadow, but some inherit theirs. Jonathan Blackwood had lived his life convinced that history was a shield, not a mirror. He was a historian by trade, accustomed to cataloguing the sins of others in tidy margins, convinced that ink and paper could contain them. But when the letter arrived that November, its seal bearing the crest of a family he had long forgotten, the past stopped being a matter of record and became a summons. The letter was short, almost indifferent. Dunstable Hall, by right of blood, now belongs to you. No explanation, no invitation, no comfort, only a destination. Jonathan folded the paper with a scholar's detachment, yet even as he set it aside, he knew that silence had been broken. The Blackwood line, distant, fractured, rumored, had stirred, and his name had been called. The journey from London was long drawn out beneath skies heavy with iron clouds. Rain lashed the windows of the coach, turning the roads to rivers of mud. Jonathan sat alone, his books unopened beside him, his mind occupied by questions he refused to frame aloud. He told himself that inheritance was a simple affair, a deed, a house, perhaps some furniture cloaked in dust. But why now? Why him? The Blackwoods had scattered generations ago, their history whispered rather than written, a subject his own professors had once avoided, as though the name itself was a contagion. When at last the coach crested the hill, he saw it, Dunstable Hall. It rose from the moors like a ruin still clinging to breath, stone walls blackened with rain, turrets hunched against the wind, windows like hollow eyes staring across the fields. The house seemed less built than unearthed, as though the land itself had grown tired of hiding it. Jonathan stepped out into the rain. The air smelled of peat and iron. His boots sank into the sodden earth, and every step toward the house felt like trespass. The villagers had warned him, though none had dared say it outright. At the inn where he had stayed the previous night, a woman with hands red from washing whispered as she set down his plate, "No heir lasts long at the Hall." When Jonathan asked what she meant, she only shook her head and muttered, "Some inherit land, others inherit debt. The Blackwoods, they inherit something else." He had laughed then, polite but dismissive, the way a scholar laughs at a superstition. But the echo of her words returned now with the wind, threading through the silence of the estate. The great doors groaned as he pushed them open. Inside, the air was stagnant, tinged with dust and old wood smoke. A cavernous hall stretched before him, lit only by the weak light filtering through stained glass. Portraits lined the walls, his ancestors, he supposed, men with hollow cheeks, and women with eyes too large for their faces. Their painted gazes followed him, steady and unblinking. Some frames were cracked, others crooked, yet all seemed alive in their stillness. Jonathan paused, feeling the weight of the house press down on him. He told himself it was imagination, the product of fatigue and storm. But his heart beat harder than reason could explain. He wandered through rooms that smelled of mildew and neglect. Dust coated the furniture, thick as ash. Curtains hung like burial shrouds. Yet there was a strange order to the decay, as though the house had been waiting rather than abandoned. In the library, he found solace among books, though most were so damp and brittle, they crumbled at his touch. He traced the shelves until his hand stopped on a ledger, thicker than the rest, bound in dark leather. It was locked. On the cover, in faded gold, were the initials J.B., though not his own. They belonged to someone who had carried his name long before him, someone whose story remained untold. Across the leather stretched a faint stain, brown-red, like the ghost of blood pressed into skin. Jonathan's breath caught. He tried the lock, but it did not yield. He turned the book over, running his fingers across its surface, feeling both the weight of secrecy and the strange intimacy of bloodlines. This ledger had been touched by his kin. Perhaps it had cost them more than words to write. The silence deepened. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked though none had moved. A draught brushed his cheek though the windows were shut. The portraits in the hall lingered in his thoughts. their painted eyes burning behind him. He closed the ledger, but his hand lingered on its surface. The house felt expectant, as though it had offered him a choice: leave now and carry nothing, or open what was never meant to be opened and claim everything. Jonathan Sett's pulse steadied, his scholarship's reason reasserting itself. "It is only a house," he whispered to the empty air. "Only a book." Yet even he heard the hollow ring of denial in his voice. That night, as rain beat against the windows and thunder rolled over the moors, Jonathan lay awake in a room meant for heirs. The bed was too large, the ceiling too high, the shadows too deep. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a step. Every gust of wind carried the murmur of voices not his own. He thought of the villagers, of the woman at the inn, of her words about inheritance. He thought of the ledger with its bloodstain, of the initials that matched his own, and he wondered what story had been written before him, what fate had already been sealed. Because a man can inherit land or wealth or duty. But what does he do when he inherits silence? When he inherits sins too old for memory, yet too heavy to ignore? Jonathan closed his eyes, but the question lingered, heavy and merciless. "And so I ask you, if you were given such an inheritance, not of gold nor of stone, but of shadows, would you dare open it, or would you leave it sealed, knowing it was written in blood?" The first truth Jonathan Blackwood learned about Dunstable Hall was that it did not welcome him. It tolerated him. On that first morning, when pale light seeped through rain-streaked windows, he rose to find the corridors colder than the night itself. The air had a dampness that clung to his skin, and though every door he had shut before sleep was still latched, the curtains had been drawn back as though by unseen hands. The house seemed to move without him, arranging itself according to its own will. At breakfast, bread and tea brought from the village arrived on a cart. The servant who delivered it was a boy scarcely old enough to speak without trembling. He would not cross the threshold. Instead, he set the tray just inside the door and withdrew at once, eyes averted as if looking too long might invite some curse. Jonathan called after him, "What have you heard of this place?" The boy shook his head quickly. "I smum not to say, sir." Then, almost as an afterthought, he whispered, weeping, "They say it never stops." And before Jonathan could ask more, the boy was gone, running down the path as though he feared the walls themselves might reach out to drag him back. The day stretched long, filled with silence too thick to ignore. Every footstep Jonathan took echoed far louder than it should have, carrying down the empty corridors. Doors resisted him, hinged stiff with neglect, and when they did yield, they seemed to sigh like reluctant guardians. Once, in the gallery where the portraits hung, Jonathan felt certain he heard the faint sound of a woman's voice. It was not words, not even song, only a low keening, fragile and persistent. He stopped, listening, the fine hairs at his neck rising, but when he pressed his ear against the wall, the sound dissolved into stillness. By evening, the house had already begun its protest. Doors closed softly behind him, though no hand touched them. Drafts slipped under panels that had no cracks. As he searched through rooms thick with dust, he noticed places where the wood of the walls was fresher, where seams did not align. Panels shifted with the weight of his hand. And behind them, passages. Narrow, airless corridors cut between the bones of the house, built not for comfort but for concealment. Some ended in bricked walls, others in trapdoors that led to stairwells curling downward into dark. Jonathan ran his lantern along the stone and timber, noting the hasty workmanship. Whoever had built these had not meant them to be seen. And he wondered, not for the first time, what the Blackwoods had sought to hide. That night, alone in the library, Jonathan returned to the locked ledger. Its leather binding was dry, cracked, yet resistant. The lock, though rusted, remained unbroken. He traced the faint brown stain again, the color of blood long dried, too familiar for any historian to mistake. "Family business," he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. His father had spoken of this house once, only once, and never again. Jonathan had been a child then, listening by the hearth. His father had described shadows that moved where no light should fall, figures that lingered just beyond vision. He had spoken of voices that asked questions no man should answer. His father had said he had left Dunstable Hall behind, and that Jonathan must never go back. But the man had died young, hollow-eyed, his own history devouring him. Jonathan remembered standing at the grave, feeling that his father had carried secrets to the soil. And now, standing before the ledger, he understood that secrets do not rest. They inherit. When dusk fell, Jonathan lit every candle in the house he could find. The moors outside disappeared into mist, and the silence deepened until the sound of his own breath became unbearable. That was when the weeping returned. Faint at first, a thread of sound winding through the corridors. A woman's voice, thin and wounded, echoing from walls that should have been still. Jonathan followed it, his lantern trembling in his grasp. Through hallways, up staircases, past locked doors it led him, until he stood before a section of paneling that looked freshly nailed. He pressed his hand against the wood. Cold seeped through it, colder than any stone, and the weeping, though muffled, was unmistakable. Jonathan staggered back, the rational part of his mind insisting it was the wind, the old house settling, tricks of acoustics. Yet even scholars must admit what their bodies already know: some sounds are not made by timber or storm. He returned at last to his chamber, his nerves frayed by the hour. The fire burned low, and shadows leapt across the ceiling like hands. He undressed, though his body would not rest, and lay upon the bed with eyes wide open. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and restless. Dreams clawed at him, images of faces he did not know, whispering in languages older than his tongue. He dreamt of the portraits in the gallery turning their heads to watch him, of hands pressing from within the walls. He dreamt of his father's voice, strained and broken, saying, "The shadows have eyes, Jonathan. They will watch until you are one of them." He woke up with a start. The fire was dead. Moonlight spilled through the curtains, painting the floor silver, and outside his chamber door, footsteps moved. Measured, heavy, humans. Jonathan froze. He heard them pause, then resume, pacing slowly, deliberately, just beyond the threshold. He whispered to himself that it was imagination, that the old house shifted with the night. But the steps were too precise, too steady. Heart pounding, he rose, reached for the candlestick beside the bed, and crept toward the door. He held his breath, pressed his ear to the wood. The steps stopped. Silence. Jonathan pulled the door open with sudden force. The corridor stretched empty before him, shadows long and still. No figure stood there. No sound lingered, only the echo of what had been. He stood for a long time, the cold air brushing his skin, before retreating inside and bolting the door. That night, Jonathan understood the hall was not a place one simply owned. It was a place that I owned. And as the wind howled against the windows, he wondered whether he had come to inherit bricks and mortar, or to inherit the sorrow buried within its walls. For what is an heir, if not the vessel of unfinished sins? The days at Dunstable Hall did not pass as time does in London. Here, hours stretched thin, caught like cobwebs across the moors. The sun seemed reluctant to rise, reluctant to linger, reluctant to shine through the heavy drapery that smothered each window. And Jonathan, who had always thought of history as something written and sealed, began to feel it breathing around him, restless, unfinished, and far too intimate. He found the study on the third day. It was a room hidden behind warped oak doors, its air thick with the scent of parchment and decay. The desk was broad, carved with patterns of ivy, and covered in a scatter of papers yellowed by centuries. Drawers resisted his efforts, but Jonathan was not deterred. He had the patience of a scholar and a gnawing hunger for what they might reveal. The records were fragments. Wills, inventories, sermons, hastily scribbled letters, Many were written in hands so cramped and uneven they looked more like confessions scratched by candlelight than the work of clerks. Jonathan began to trace them, one name after another. Each was a Blackwood. Each was a chapter of ruin. The ledger had waited long enough. For days Jonathan carried its weight from room to room, the leather binding whispering against his palm, the rusted lock refusing to yield. It haunted him from the corner of his vision, heavy with promise, with threat. Each time he passed through the study he swore the air grew colder, as though the book drew breath of its own. On the seventh night he could no longer resist. The fire in the library had burned low, throwing shadows across the shelves. Jonathan placed the ledger upon the desk, its blackened leather gleaming faintly. He searched the drawers, finding a set of rusted keys, none of which fit. At last, in frustration, he took up the poker from the hearth and brought it down against the lock. Once, twice, sparks flew, and the sound rang through the house like a shot. The lock split. The ledger opened. The first page was written in a steady and deliberate hand, Thomas Blackwood, 1650. The words that followed were not records of crops or tenants, not the dry business of a landowner. They were confessions. I have bound myself to the covenant. The land prospers, the halls rise, but it is not without cost. The tithe is demanded, and I have given it. Blood for stone, flesh for timber. My sons will continue, or all we have built shall rot. Jonathan's stomach turned. He turned the page, and the next, and the next. Each bore the same hand, the same grim litany, offerings given, nights of ritual described in detail, too careful to be delusion. He read of chambers beneath the house, of candles guttering in unseen winds, of voices not human answering from the dark. The entries grew jagged with the passing years. Different hands appeared, each heir adding their confession, each acknowledging the covenant as if it were a duty as sacred as birth itself. I have poured the blood as my father did before me. The harvests are spared when the offering is made. They whisper to me in my sleep, reminding me of my debt. Jonathan's pulse quickened. This was not rumor, not gossip passed down through fearful villagers. This was his family's own words, written in their own hands. Halfway through the book, his lantern flickered. Shadows deepened, stretching like grasping fingers across the desk. Jonathan forced himself to keep reading. The later pages told of heirs who faltered, who sought to resist. Each time the pattern was the same. Disaster followed. A child sickened, a barn burned, a family member vanished. The covenant did not forgive. And then Jonathan Sett's hands froze. For there in script he recognized lay the handwriting of his father. His throat tightened as he read the words aloud in a whisper. I cannot, I will not. Let the house take me if it must. I will not give blood to shadows, nor bind my son to this sin. The final line was underlined, pressed deep into the paper as though carved in desperation. It ends with me. Jonathan's hands shook. His father's death, sudden, unexplained, whispered by doctors as an organ failure, had struck him as a cruel chance. But here, in his own words, his father had marked himself for the house's wrath. His refusal had been his execution. The air in the study grew colder. Jonathan's breath smoked. The fire sputtered, though no draught touched it. He turned to the final pages. The handwriting was uneven, frantic, as though scrawled in haste. Ink blotted and smeared. The last entry bore no name, no date, only a sentence unfinished. The house will claim. The line ended in a jagged trail. The pen dragged across the page as if torn from the writer's hand. Jonathan stared at it, heart hammering. The silence in the study grew unbearable, pressing against his ears until it seemed to hum. He felt certain that if he turned he would see someone standing behind him. But he did not turn. He closed the ledger with shaking hands, though the echo of its words would not leave him. The covenant was no metaphor, no superstition. His ancestors had written it as plainly as law. Each heir had bound themselves to it, save one, and his father had paid the price. That night, Jonathan did not sleep. He sat in his chamber, the ledger on the table beside him, a single candle guttering against the dark. His thoughts ran circles, his reason fighting what his blood already knew. He remembered the banquet dream, the table drenched in blood, the empty seats waiting for him. He remembered the footsteps in the hall, the weeping in the walls. He remembered the villagers' eyes, full of pity they would not voice. And he thought of the unfinished line, "The house will claim." Claim what? Claim who? Jonathan gripped his temples, whispering into the silence, "What is it you want from me?" No answer came, not in words. But the candle bent, as though a breath had passed across it. The shadows swayed, and in the silence of Dunstable Hall, Jonathan understood that the ledger had not merely recorded history, it had called him into it. He rose and crossed the room, locking the door, though he knew it would not matter. He tried to still his hands, but they trembled as if the very ink of his father's words flowed in his veins. He could not shake the thought that Thomas Blackwood had bargained centuries ago not for land, nor for wealth, nor for legacy, but for a prison that bound them all, generation after generation, to a debt that never ended. And if his father's refusal had ended his life, then what would become of Jonathan, who had now opened the book and read aloud the covenant? The house groaned around him, the timbers creaking as if in answer. The air carried again that faint copper tang, the scent of old blood rising from unseen places. Jonathan shut his eyes, his heart clawing at his chest. He knew the ledger was no longer just paper and ink. It was a door, and he had opened it. And beyond that door waited something patient, something hungry, something that had waited centuries for him. There was Elias Blackwood, who drowned in the Manor's well in 1713. Margaret Blackwood, who was found hanging in her chamber in 1751. Henry Blackwood, who wasted to a husk at only 25, doctors unable to name the illness. Children who vanished, heirs who never saw their 30th year, wives who were widowed before their vows were warm. Jonathan read until his hands trembled. Line after line, record after record, the pattern emerged. The Blackwoods did not die as other men died. They were unmade, claimed by something that resisted reason. And at the beginning of every branch, at the root of every name, stood Thomas Blackwood. Thomas had built Dunstable Hall in 1648 in the wake of England's Civil War. Jonathan studied the records carefully, piecing together the scraps. Thomas had been a soldier, then a landowner, then a man of sudden and inexplicable fortune. He had purchased vast stretches of moorland, erected the manor with impossible speed, and cemented himself as a figure both feared and envied. But the letters spoke in whispers. A villager Sib's note described Thomas as a man who spoke with shadows. A local priest warned of covenants sealed not with ink, but with blood untold. Jonathan leaned back, his eyes burning from the candlelight. He felt the truth beneath the words, though his mind resisted it. Every historian knows that rumor weaves itself around power, that envy births tales of sorcery and pact. Yet as he sat there, alone with the papers, he could not shake the weight of his own blood. For the portraits in the gallery bore his face. That afternoon he returned to them, lantern in hand. He walked the long hall where the painted eyes watched. There was Thomas himself, broad-shouldered, with a gaze that pierced through centuries. His mouth was stern, but the faintest curl at its edge suggested triumph or mockery. Jonathan's own reflection stared back at him from the canvas. Beside Thomas were sons and grandsons, all pale, all gaunt, all bearing that same sharp line of cheek and brow that now belonged to Jonathan. It was as though the Blackwoods had never died, but only worn his face again and again. He stood frozen beneath their judgment. The silence grew heavy, pressing at his chest, and he whispered, perhaps to the air, perhaps to the painted bloodline itself. "What did you sell, Thomas, and what remains to be paid?" The villagers spoke of him cautiously when he ventured into the hamlet the following day. They turned their eyes away, reluctant to stand too close, as though something clung to him they feared might pass by touch. When Jonathan asked Thomas Blackwood, most would not answer. One old man, hunched with age, spat into the dirt and muttered, "The hall was not built with stone alone. Blood holds its walls." That was his covenant. Riches for death. The land for the marrow of his kin. Jonathan pressed him for more, but the man only shook his head. "Best not to ask, sir. Old wrath wakes up easily." And with that he limped away, leaving Jonathan with nothing but the wind and a chill that no sun could lift. That night Jonathan sat in the study again, the locked ledger before him. He ran his fingers over the cover, over the stain that would not fade, and whispered, "You wrote it down, didn't set you? Every bargain, every debt." But the lock resisted, and the truth remained sealed. Exhausted, he retired to his chamber. He lay down, but his mind did not rest. Thoughts of Thomas swirled in him, of his sudden fortune, of the covenant the villagers feared, of the faces in the portraits that mirrored his own. Sleep came as if dragged upon him, heavy and unwilling. And then the dream began. He found himself seated at a long banquet table, stretching farther than sight allowed. The hall was grand, its walls dripping with velvet banners, its chandeliers dripping with wax. Before him lay platters of meat, bread, fruit, but all drowned in blood. It soaked the tablecloth, pooled in silver cups, dripped from the roasted flesh. The chairs beside him were empty, yet stained as though guests had risen moments before. Jonathan looked down and saw his own hands painted red, his reflection warped in the wine-dark pools. He tried to rise, but the chair held him fast. Across the table, a figure appeared, tall, shadowed, its face hidden, but its voice sharp with familiarity. "Sit," it said. Jonathan Setch's throat closed. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, as though amused. "You are, we are. Blood is never one man Sep's burden." And then the chairs around him began to fill, faces pale and sunken, eyes hollow, mouths torn in screams. Elias, Margaret, Henry, the line of Blackwoods, every name he had traced in the study, now seated, their ruin displayed upon them. Their eyes fixed upon Jonathan with a hunger he could not bear. He clutched the arms of his chair, heart pounding, as the figure leaned forward and whispered, "You are late to the feast." Jonathan woke with a strangled cry. His sheets were damp with sweat, his hands trembling as though they still bore the weight of blood. The fire had gone cold, the room dark save for moonlight. But in the air lingered the faintest scent, copper, sweet and unmistakable. The scent of blood. The first true fracture in Jonathan's resolve came not from what he read, but from what he heard. At night, when the wind moved like a restless animal through the moors, another sound threaded its way through the house's vast halls, a lullaby. Not the gentle rocking tune of a mother, but something older, crooned in a language his ears could not decipher yet, his bones seemed to recognize. It came through the walls, soft, insidious, like the hum of bees inside plaster. Sometimes it rose from beneath the floorboards, other times it sighed through the rafters above. No matter where he turned, the song followed. When Jonathan pressed his ear to the wall, the melody deepened, the voice joining with others, as though the very timbers of the manor remembered. The words slid against his mind, pressing at the folds of memory he did not own. He tore away, gasping, and swore never to listen again. Yet when night returned, he could not resist. The house, once silent, now moved in subtle agonies. The portraits that lined the corridors, faded oil renderings of stern Blackwood patriarchs and hollow-eyed wives, began to shift. Jonathan would pass them in the gloom, candlelight flickering, and see red streaks staining their painted cheeks. At first he thought it was some trick of wax, a flaw in the varnish, but the droplets fell, wet and viscous, down the frames, leaving trails of crimson against the canvas. He tried to clean one, scrubbing with cloth until his hands shook. The face beneath was unchanged, yet the tears welled again as though springing from the paint itself. He covered the portraits with sheets, but still at night he dreamed of their stares, dozens of eyes opening at once in the dark, regarding him as one regards a trespasser. And then came the shadows. They lengthened where light should have cut them short. In morning sun, Jonathan's own shadow reached the far wall, arms unnaturally outstretched like some dark parody of crucifixion. The hearth cast shapes that did not belong to the furniture. Once, as he climbed the main staircase, he saw a figure in silhouette waiting at the landing, broad-shouldered, familiar in stance. His father. Jonathan's voice cracked as he whispered into the void. "Is it you?" But the shadow bent and stretched, flowing back into the walls until nothing remained. Panic drove him to the gates. If the house wished to cage him, he would resist. He stumbled through the overgrown garden, briars cutting his hands, and pushed against the iron gates. But where once rust had been mild, it now clung thick as scabs. The hinges, only days before capable of groaning open, were fused solid, as though decades of decay had passed overnight. He beat them with a stone, tore at the bars with bloodied palms, but they did not yield. Above, crows wheeled in the sky, a murder circling endlessly. From the village road beyond the hedgerow, he caught sight of a woman, a villager he half remembered as a servant's niece. She saw him through the iron lattice and froze. Her hand rose not in greeting, but in warding. She crossed herself once, twice, lips moving in prayer before she fled into the mist. Jonathan was alone, alone with the house, and the house was waking. Each day its hunger grew more apparent. Doors refused to open until he muttered words he had never learned yet somehow knew. Windows fogged from within, scrolled with shapes like handprints pressed from the other side. At night, the lullabies returned, joined by murmurs, whispers, conversations he could not fully catch. He felt them circling him as he walked, brushing the edges of his perception. And the cellar called. He had avoided it at first, content to roam the study, the corridors, the rotting guest rooms. But after breaking the ledger's lock, after reading of debts and blood, he could no longer ignore the door at the far corner of the wine cellar. It was older than the rest, planks swollen with damp, its iron hinges scarred with rust. Across it, nailed into the wood in a crude lattice, were iron spikes, each driven deep enough to leave splintered cracks. The nails formed a cross, tilted and imperfect, as if fashioned by desperate hands. Jonathan's father had never spoken of it. No servant had mentioned it. Yet every time Jonathan descended with his lantern, he felt his heart hammer with recognition, as though he had always known it was there. The closer he came, the more the lullabies quieted, replaced by silence so dense it roared in his ears. His fingers hovered above the latch. The metal was cold, too cold for the stale cellar air. His skin prickled. It was not only the dread of opening what lay beyond, it was the awareness that the house itself was urging him to. The floorboards above groaned when he turned away, the walls creaked with disappointment, and the shadows seemed to lean toward the door, waiting. That night, Jonathan dreamed again. He sat at the banquet table from before, but this time the empty chairs were filled. Ancestors long dead, Thomas Blackwood, his eyes like obsidian, hands red as fresh wounds. Eleanor Blackwood, pale as bone, her throat slit but smiling all the same, and others, dozens of them bearing marks of their deaths, yet seated in eternal communion. They beckoned him to sit. A goblet was raised. Wine, dark and thick, spilled across the table. No, not wine. Blood. Jonathan awoke screaming, his sheets drenched in sweat. He lit every candle in his chamber, but the flames bent sideways, pointing toward the cellar door far below. He knew then that whatever curse clung to his bloodline, it was not content with remembrance. It demanded continuation. And so, barefoot and trembling, Jonathan descended the stairs, lanterns swaying. The lullabies had ceased. The portraits wept in silence. Even the shadows seemed to hold their breath. All that remained was the door, the nails gleaming faintly like stars in the dark. His hand hovered over the latch. His father's unfinished words echoed in his mind. The house will claim. Claim what? His soul? His life? Or something greater? The latch was cold beneath his hand, biting into his skin as though alive. Jonathan whispered into the silence, voice shaking. "Is this what you brought me here for? To finish what my father refused?" The house did not answer, but the nails creaked. One loosened, ever so slightly, as if from the inside. The question hung in the air, heavy, dreadful, and unrelenting. When Jonathan opens that door, will it reveal the truth of his family's curse, or will it simply consume him whole? The air in the cellar was thick, heavy with the reek of damp earth and something older, coppery, metallic, and faintly sweet, like blood left too long in the heat. Jonathan's lantern flickered as he stood before the door, the nails arranged in their desperate crooked cross. For a long moment he did not breathe. The stillness was suffocating. Then, with trembling hands, he pried the first nail free. It screeched against the wood, the sound splitting through the silence like a cry. One by one, the others followed, until the cross lay broken at his feet, useless, its protection undone. The latch resisted only a moment before snapping loose in his grasp. The door groaned open, exhaling air that had been trapped for centuries. It was colder here, but beneath the chill lurked something else, a strange radiance of heat, as though the stones themselves pulsed with buried breath. Jonathan lifted the lantern and stepped inside. The chamber was not vast, but it was deep, its walls carved from the living earth. At its heart stood an altar of blackened stone, rough and ancient, its surface marred by gouges and fissures. Stains darkened the grooves, soaked deep into the rock, layered upon itself in patterns of violence too numerous to count. It was not dust that coated the floor, but bones splintered, shattered, brittle with age. Some were long, heavy, unmistakably human. Others were small, frail, belonging to children. They lay scattered like discarded offerings. The walls told their own story. Carvings, crude but unmistakable, stretched from floor to ceiling. They showed figures bowed in chains, kneeling before a faceless silhouette etched deep into the stone. The thing they worshipped had no form, no features, only a void of shape, an emptiness into which every eye was turned. Around it, lines curled in strange geometries, patterns that twisted when Jonathan tried to follow them, as if meant not for human sight, but for something else entirely. Jonathan's heart pounded. His breath came shallow. Every part of him urged retreat, but his feet carried him forward, compelled by some ancient recognition. The altar loomed before him, taller than he had expected, blackened by centuries of hands, knives, and flames. As he drew close, he swore he could feel warmth radiating from it, as if embers still smoldered within the stone. He reached out, hesitating, then laid his hand upon the surface. Heat coursed through his palm, spreading up his arm, threading itself into his chest. His vision blurred. For a moment he thought he smelled smoke, but then the chamber itself seemed to flicker and shift. The walls glowed faintly, the carvings moving like shadows in firelight, writhing with silent supplication. And then he heard it. Not the lullaby this time, but a whisper, low, intimate, as though spoken directly against his ear. The words were not English, not any tongue he knew, but he understood them all the same. They spoke of pacts sealed in marrow, of promises kept by the spilling of blood, of a vessel, of a house. Dunstable Hall had not been built as a dwelling for men. It had been constructed as a cradle, a monument, a body awaiting its heart. The realization struck like lightning. His family had not merely lived in this house, they had fed it. Every death, every sacrifice, every stain upon the altar was not a mistake of history, but a continuation of covenant. His ancestors had bound themselves to something faceless, something that required not worship in prayer, but worship in flesh. Jonathan staggered back, his hand still burning from the stone, his lantern guttered, throwing wild shadows across the chamber. In their shapes, he thought he saw faces, familiar faces. His father, his grandfather, even the stern visages of the portraits upstairs, all watching, waiting. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, as the whispers rose to a chant, and then mercifully, darkness claimed him. When he woke, he was no longer in the chamber. He lay in his bed, sheets tangled around him, as though he had thrashed in fever. His lantern sat at the bedside table, unlit, though he remembered dropping it on the stones below. For a moment, he thought it had all been dream, until he raised his hand. The palm was blistered, red as fire. The mark of the altar burned into his flesh. That night, Jonathan dreamed again. He stood in the chamber below, but it was not empty. The altar blazed with unseen light, and before it stood a figure, his father. The man's face was pale, waxen, his eyes hollow yet burning with a strange intensity. His lips moved, but Jonathan heard the words inside his own head rather than through sound. "You are the last." Jonathan Sepp's breath shuddered in his throat. "Father, what does it mean?" The figure leaned closer. Its voice was no longer gentle but edged with finality, a decree written in stone. "Choose or be chosen." Jonathan woke screaming, the words echoing in his ears long after silence reclaimed the room. He stumbled to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The village below was dark, lifeless. No sound of carts, no smoke from chimneys. The world beyond the gates felt as dead as the bones beneath the house. He turned toward the door of his chamber, half expecting to see shadows waiting. Instead, he saw only the flicker of his candle, and upon the floor, a smear of fresh blood leading out into the corridor. Jonathan's mind reeled. If the choice truly lay with him, what was it? To flee was impossible. To resist was meaningless. The altar still breathed. The house still waited. His father's words lingered like a wound that would not close. If Jonathan does not choose, then what or who will the house choose for him? Morning never truly came to Dunstable Hall. The sun rose somewhere beyond the moors, but here light arrived only as a muted pallor filtered through the warped glass of its windows. Jonathan had begun to measure time, not by daylight but by the rhythm of the whispers, those soft murmurings that swelled and receded like a tide within the walls. He stood before a mirror in the upstairs corridor, its gilt frame dulled by tarnish. His reflection was a stranger. Hollow-eyed, gaunt, his skin had taken on the same sallow hue as the portraits that lined the hall. He traced the blistered mark on his palm, the angry welt branded there by the altar, and for an instant, just an instant, the reflection moved when he did not. A figure loomed behind him in the glass, tall as the rafters, its head bowed, its face lost in a drift of smoke. The smoke pulsed like breath, curling and coiling, but within its swirls he glimpsed shapes, hands, mouths, eyes that opened and closed without pattern. Jonathan spun around, heart pounding, but the corridor behind him lay empty. Only the cold air and the smell of old wood greeted him. He pressed his hands to the mirror, searching for any trace of the vision. His palms left smears across the glass. For a moment the smoke reappeared, not behind him this time, but within the reflection itself, as though the mirror were a window into some unseen chamber. Then it faded, leaving only his own stricken face staring back. The voices began at dusk. At first, they were no more than stray thoughts, stray fragments. The rustle of drapes sounded like his name. The groan of old wood resembled a command. But by nightfall the whispers were words. They rose from the paneling, seeped from the cracks in the stone, drifted from the hearth like smoke. A dozen voices, or perhaps only one, layered upon itself. "Feed the hall," it murmured. "Keep it full, keep it sleeping." Jonathan clutched the family ledger, though its pages brought no comfort. He had pored over them again and again, searching for some record of rebellion, some clue that an heir had survived without submitting. But every entry told the same story: the ritual performed, the offering given, the silence restored for a time. And then his father's handwriting, stark and final: refusal, no offering, no blood. A death that came sudden and unexplained. The ledger had no entry for what followed, only the trailing words: "The house will claim," cut off mid-stroke. Jonathan's breath fogged in the chill of the library. The fireplace had gone cold, though he had stoked it only an hour before. In its embers he thought he saw movement, a face forming and dissolving in the glow. The whispers pressed against his skull like a tide, rising until he thought his mind would split. "Why me?" he whispered aloud, though no one was there. His voice cracked with the weight of it. "I did not ask for this. I did not choose this." But the answer came, low and coiling, a voice felt more than heard. "You were born chosen." The words struck him like a blow. He staggered back from the hearth, clutching at the edge of the desk. His father's face flashed in his mind, the same haunted eyes, the same tremor in the hands, the same futile search for an escape that did not exist. Later that night, he ventured to the village, desperate for air, for distance from the walls that seemed to breathe. The path wound through blackened hedgerows. Every cottage shuttered its windows at his approach. He saw no faces, only the flicker of candles hurriedly snuffed. At last, one old woman dared to meet his eyes from across a low stone fence. Her mouth was a hard line, her hands trembled around a string of beads she clutched like a weapon. "You said the Blackwood heir," she said, her voice rough with age and fear. "You have come for the hall." "I have come because it was left to me," Jonathan answered, his voice brittle. "I don't want it." She shook her head slowly. "None of you wanted it, but it wants you." Her words were like frost. Jonathan swallowed hard. The ledger, the rituals. What did my family keep there? The woman spat on the ground, muttered a prayer under her breath. "A hunger, older than the hole, older than the land it stands on. They'd built it a cradle, and fed it to keep it sleeping, and when the feeding stops," she trailed off, glancing toward the manor as though afraid it might hear, "it wakes." Jonathan gripped the fence until the wood bit into his palms. "My father," he refused, "and it killed him." "No," the woman said, "it took him, as it will take you if you do not do as they did. Feed it, or be fed to it. That seps the bargain." Her eyes flicked over his shoulder. "It follows you now, in the windows, in the glass. You has seen it." Jonathan turned, but the lane was empty, only mist curling over the fields. He felt the prickling at the base of his skull, the pressure of being watched. The woman crossed herself. "If you see its face, it says already claimed you." He tried to speak, but she was already retreating into her cottage. The door bolted shut behind her. No candle light returned to the window. Jonathan stood alone on the path, the hall rising in the distance, its windows like blind eyes staring across the moor. He felt the weight of it, a pull like gravity drawing him back. When he returned to the manor, the gate swung open without his touching it. He stepped through, and it clanged shut behind him with a sound like iron locking into place. Inside, the whispers had grown louder, no longer words but a chant rising from the floors, the walls, the ceilings. In every mirror, every pane of glass, smoke gathered, coalescing into a shape too tall, too thin, its head brushing the ceiling beams. Its face was veiled, but beneath the veil, darkness shifted like a sea. Jonathan's knees weakened. He clutched the railing of the staircase to stay upright. The voices filled his head until he thought his skull would crack. "You are the keeper," they intoned. "You are the blood, Feed the hole. Keep it sleeping. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound was within him, not without. He saw again the banquet table from his dream, laden with red, the empty chairs waiting for him to sit. He saw his father, eyes hollow, whispering, "Choose or be chosen." Jonathan stumbled to the center of the hall. The portraits above seemed to shift, mouths open as if crying out, but no sound came. The entity's shadow fell over him, vast and cold, blotting out even the weak light from the sconces. His voice broke as he shouted into the empty air. "What do you want from me?" The answer was a silence deeper than any sound. Then the veil of smoke bent closer, the presence pressing against his mind until his thoughts were no longer his own. "We want what we have always been given." Jonathan dropped to his knees. His hands shook as he pressed them to his temples. He could taste iron on his tongue. He thought of his father's final entry, the ink trailing off, cut short. He thought of the bones in the chamber below, of the carved chains of the altar still warm to the touch. The hall had marked him. The hall had always been waiting. And somewhere beneath his terror, a darker thought stirred, unbidden. Perhaps it was easier to obey, to give it what it wanted, to end the hunger. The voices rose, soft and almost tender. "Keep her, keep her, keep her." Jonathan shuddered. For the first time he wondered if the hunger he felt was not the hall's but his own. The ledger lay upon the desk like a wound that refused to close. Jonathan stared at it, its cracked leather swollen with the weight of centuries, its pages heavy with blood disguised as ink. Each word written by his forebears was a chain binding him tighter to the house. The whispers had not ceased since the visitation. They had become constant, woven into the rhythm of his breathing. He had tried to shut them out with wine, with prayers muttered into the night, with silence held until his lungs burned. But the voices remained, soft and steady, a chorus that repeated one truth: feed the hall, keep it sleeping. At last, in desperation, he seized the ledger. If the house was fed by memory, by record, by the keeping of the covenant, then perhaps he could starve it. Perhaps by erasing the past, he could unmake the present. He dragged it to the fireplace in the study. Flames already smoldered there, weak but eager, gnawing at the logs with orange teeth. Jonathan held the book above them. His hands shook as though the weight of generations pressed against him, resisting his intent. "This ends now," he whispered. His voice cracked against the stones. "Your words will not bind me. Your covenant dies here." He hurled the ledger into the flames. For a heartbeat, relief surged. The book landed among the embers, its cover catching light, but then the fire sputtered, as though strangled by unseen hands. The flames bent away from the ledger, shrinking, choking, until only smoke remained. The logs smoldered to ash, the fire snuffed out, and yet the book lay untouched. Not a page singed, not a letter marred. The air in the study grew cold. Shadows lengthened on the walls, spreading like oil across stone. They stretched toward him, curling like serpents, their edges shifting with hunger. Jonathan stumbled back, his shoulder striking the desk. The whispers rose to a wail, no longer tender, but demanding, wrathful. He tore from the study, the shadows surging after him, seeping through cracks and corners. He fled into the hall, then into the narrow stairwell that led toward the servants' quarters. The house groaned around him, timbers buckling as though the walls themselves bent in pursuit. He found himself in the hidden passages, those narrow veins of stone that ran like arteries behind the paneling. The air there was damp, stale, heavy, with centuries of neglect. His lantern shook in his grasp, its flame guttering but not extinguishing. The passage bent sharply, and Jonathan nearly tripped over what lay in the corner. At first he thought it a bundle of rags, some forgotten remnant of a servant's life. But when the lantern light fell upon it, his breath caught. Bones, small bones, the skeleton of a child, curled against the wall as though it had hidden there, waiting for rescue that never came. One bony hand still clutched a doll, its porcelain face cracked, its dress eaten by time. Jonathan sank to his knees, the lantern trembling so violently it painted the walls with wild arcs of light. His throat constricted as he stared at the remains. This was no accident, no servant forgotten. The truth seeped through him like poison. It was not strangers the house demanded, not the wanderer, not the thief, not the foreigner drawn to its gates. It demanded its own blood. Sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, fed into the walls by the hands of their kin. His ancestors had murdered their children generation after generation to keep the hall alive. Jonathan's breath broke into sobs. He reached out, but his hand trembled too much to touch the small bones. The doll's cracked face stared back at him, its eyes hollow, its mouth frozen in a painted smile. No, his voice cracked against the silence. God, no. The whispers swelled around him, pressing against his ears, his eyes, his mind. They were faithful. The voices hissed. They kept the covenant. They fed the hall. You must do the same. Jonathan staggered to his feet, fury boiling through his grief. Never, he shouted into the passage, his voice raw, echoing like thunder. I will not spill blood for you. Not mine, not another Heb's. The curse ends with me. The house groaned in reply, the sound a low and grinding quake that rattled the stones. Dust rained from the ceiling. The shadows twisted in rage, crawling toward him along the walls, faster, hungrier. Jonathan stumbled backward, clutching the lantern, as if it were the last light in the world. He burst from the passage into the open hall, heart hammering, lungs burning. He could feel the house watching him, seething with its ancient hunger. But beneath his terror lay something stronger, resolve. For the first time he understood the true cost of his family's survival. He saw his father's rebellion not as weakness, but as courage, the only Blackwood who had dared refuse. And though that refusal had cost him his life, Jonathan felt a strange pride burn in his chest. His father had died free, unshackled by the covenant. Jonathan swore he would do the same. He stood in the great hall, the lantern raised high, his face gaunt but unflinching. His voice, though hoarse, rang clear. You will not have me. You will not have another. The Blackwood line ends here, and so does your reign. The house trembled. The portraits rattled upon their hooks. The air thickened with smoke, curling and coiling, until the figure appeared once more, tall as the rafters, its face veiled, its shadow blotting out every flame. Jonathan Unstee's knees shook, but he did not bow. The voices rose in a single deafening chorus. Keeper, keeper, keeper. And Jonathan, trembling but resolute, whispered back, not anymore. The battle was only beginning. But for the first time since setting foot in Dunstable Hall, Jonathan felt the faintest spark of defiance blaze within his chest. The house would not be fed. And if it hungered, then let it starve. The hall thrums like a living heart. Its windows explode outward in bursts of glass, scattering like black ice across the moor. Portraits twist on their hooks, their faces unrecognizable, as if the house is shedding its memories. The floorboards quake beneath Jonathan's feet, the timber groaning like a ship in a storm. He no longer feels like an intruder, he feels like prey. Beyond the gates, the villagers have gathered, their silhouettes wavering in the mist, clutching rosaries and muttering prayers they no longer believe will help them. They have seen this before. They know how it ends. In the cellar, the altar pulses as though it draws breath. Candles light themselves one by one, a circle of flame closing in. Jonathan's body trembles, but his mind has never been clearer. The ledger, the rituals, the whispers, all of it was meant to lead him here. Every heir before him stood in this place, knife in hand, deciding who would die so the hall might live. Some chose strangers, others chose family. His father refused and was claimed. Now Jonathan understands there is no ending it without blood. The faceless entity rises from the far wall, tall as the beams, its smoke-like shroud roiling in unseen winds. Countless eyes shimmer faintly within the void of its face. It does not speak, but Jonathan feels its hunger in his bones, an ancient contract older than his family, older than the stones of the hall itself. The knife meant for another lies on the altar, its blade dark with dried offerings. Jonathan lifts it. He thinks of his father's final words, of the child's skeleton hidden behind the walls, of every soul who suffered so the house might endure. A calm falls over him, strange and absolute. The house wants his blood. It will not have another's. He turns the blade inward. "It ends with me," he whispers, and with one swift motion he drives the knife into his own chest. His blood spreads across the altar like spilled ink, filling the carved grooves with red light. The hall shudders, then roars, a sound like 1,000 voices breaking at once. Outside, the villagers drop to their knees as the sky above Dunstable Hall turns black, then suddenly, impossibly clear. The hall shrieks as if it were a dying thing. Flames erupt not from hearths or candles, but from the very walls, racing through the hidden passages and seared beams, as though the house itself had been waiting for this moment. Windows burst outward in fiery cascades, scattering molten glass into the night. The villagers, huddled at the distant gates, dare not cross the threshold, for the air is thick with the stench of burning flesh and old, rotting wood. Dunstable Hall convulses in on itself, timbers groaning, stones crumbling, until the vast estate collapses like a lung, exhaling for the final time. The ground quakes, and a tower of black smoke rises toward the heavens, a funeral pyre for centuries of blood and secrets. Some swear they hear voices within that smoke, wails, prayers, laughter, before the night swallows them whole. When the fire dies, nothing remains but scorched earth and the skeletal fragments of stone walls. Jonathan's body is never recovered. Some insist his sacrifice broke the covenant, that the curse ended the moment his blood touched the altar. Others whisper in taverns and by churchyards that the hall did not die, it fed, that Jonathan was not destroyed but taken. His soul bound within the ruins, a new keeper for an ancient hunger. The land where Dunstable Hall once stood remains lifeless, untouched by grass or flower. Livestock refuse to graze near it. Children are warned never to wander close. Yet still, on nights when the air is still and the moon is thin, the villagers claim they hear faint weeping drifting from the blackened foundations. Some say it is Jonathan mourning what was lost. Others believe it is the hall itself, waiting for the day it may rise again. And so the story lingers, not with closure but with a question: was Jonathan's final act salvation, or was it merely the beginning of something far worse?